Hello, my brothers, and welcome again. We're reflecting on Don Albera, Paolo Albera, second successor of Don Bosco, and his teachings during this week of reflection and retreat. Let's begin with a prayer. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death. Amen. Mary, help of Christians, pray for us. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Well, okay, we began and looked at the early life of Paul Albera. We looked at also some of his contributions in the very first offering. And I want to go through his formation quickly, but to get to some of the content of what he teaches. And I just want to say this. We talked about him coming to the oratory. He became a Salesian basically at the age of almost 15. We saw him in the photographs of Don Bosco in 1860, the very first photographs, and that he is the boy that Don Bosco is with when Don Bosco is hearing confessions, and the boy who's making the confession is Paul Albera, or Paulino, little Paul. So realize that although he looks very young in that picture, he's 15 years old, and realize that he's also a Salesian at that time, although he's not in a cassock, there's no insignia, and that basically very few people knew that he was a Salesian. And I told you that this would create a little bit of difficulty for him a little bit later, because his good parish priest, Father Abrate, Matteo Abrate, was so eager to see him go through formation and become a priest that he was backing that decision towards priesthood all the way. But that Don Abrate did not understand that Don Bosco was founding a new religious community. Just to say this, that remember that there's no seminary at the time because the Archbishop had closed it in 1848. So that's already 12 years before Don Bosco founds and Paul Albera becomes a Salesian. So as a young man, there's no seminary that Don Bosco can send him to. Instead, Paolo Albera is going to school at the oratory, and then with some of the friends, priests that Don Bosco knows who are teaching, he is able to offer the philosophy courses, the theology courses that would be needed by those young Salesians. And so just to say that he doesn't go into a big structure of study, but he studies. And as he studies, he's also involved at the oratory, that is, in the boarding facility, the Casa Nesso, the boarding house at the oratory, which Don Bosco says is annexed to the oratory. So Valdocco has an oratory, a youth center. It has a boarding. It has a school, a middle school, moving towards starting a high school. And that there's also a trade school and trade shop. So all these activities, and they continue to grow as Don Bosco is able to meet the needs of young people. And Albera is right there at the end of the 50s, beginning of the 1860s, when the area is really growing quite a bit. Now, just to say this, we can say that Albera, who is doing his studies, who learns oratory assistance already as a boy, who was very much helpful to the financial administrator of the oratory, and he used to like to help him, and he was found to be very, very efficient, very good, very meticulous, and so the financial administrator really could depend on this young person. And so these are the things he's doing while he's studying. He would also be at the oratory as Don Bosco is foreseeing an expansion. So we know that it's in 1862 that Don Bosco will be starting to think of building a bigger church. And we know that it's when he has been hearing confessions late into the evening that he comes back into the dining room to get something to eat. And Paulino had been the waiter there for the others, and he's cleaning up the dining room, and then Don Bosco comes in. So Paulino helps prepare the little meal for him, warm up the soup that Don Bosco is going to take. And as he's eating this supper, he's thinking of, it's too crowded. We need a bigger place. We need a bigger church. And so he asks if Paolo can get him a piece of paper, which he does. And then he draws there an idea he has for a bigger church. So remember, at the time, there's just what had been the Pinardi house that Don Bosco is expanding. There was now the Church of St. Francis de Sales that Don Bosco built in 1852. 10 years later, it's already obsolete. It's too small for just the oratory, but there's a lot of people from the neighborhood that are coming because there are no parish churches there. So this is where he thinks of building a big church. And so with Paulino there, he's talking and he's asking his opinion. So he's asking the opinion of this teenager, essentially. And Paulino gives him ideas, and he's drawing it. And then he'll make his proposal for the church, which he'll call the Church of Mary, Help of Christians. 1862, he's coming up with this idea. And so there it is. Paulino helps him. In 1863, though, Paulino leaves Valdoco, and he goes with Michael Rua, young priest, just ordained in 1860, and they go out to Mirabello, out in the countryside, and they're starting a new school. It's actually Don Bosco's first school away from the oratory. It's his first house away from Valdoco. In fact, it's the second house that he ever founds. And that's in Mirabello, this little country town, farming area. And they start this boarding school there. Actually, they take over what had been like a junior seminary or a small seminary, and Don Bosco takes that over. The first rector is Michael Rua. And the first assistant is Paolo Albera. And so this is this very small little group, and they go there and they start the school. Among the first students would be Filippo Rinaldi from Lu, Monferrato, Philip Rinaldi. So it's interesting because when Don Bosco comes to Mirabello to visit, there's on record Eugenio Ceria tells us how Don Bosco goes there, and of course he knows Philip Rinaldi because Don Bosco had gone to Lu, Monferrato, his town, and they bring Philip in to talk with Don Bosco, and there they are in the dining room with Don Rua, and it's Albera who brings in Rinaldi because Albera was the assistant. And so Ceria says, isn't it significant that in the same room we have the founder and his first three successors? Of course, they didn't know they were his successors. They barely know that Don Bosco is the founder because the founding is going on. That's 1863. But that sort of tells, interestingly enough, the sort of heroic times. These very first collaborators with Don Bosco, who had been youth and boys and young people that Don Bosco worked with or knew, but that they worked with one another. Rua was the director of Albera and of Rinaldi. Albera was the assistant of Philip Rinaldi as a schoolboy, and he was also one of the clerics formed by his first rector. There you can say would be Don Rua. So there they all are in the same collection. And what's interesting about all of them is how they live, not just the ideas and the ambitions and the goals of Don Bosco, but the very style of Don Bosco. So much so that when Philip Rinaldi was already a priest, and people met Don Bosco and they met Don Rinaldi, and they said, oh, he's got everything like Don Bosco except the voice. That is, his mannerisms, his ideas, the way he expressed himself. Don Rinaldi, blessed Philip Rinaldi. And what about Albera? Well, in France, they would call him Le Petit Don Bosco, the little Don Bosco, because he was so much in his approach, in his attitudes, in his style as an educator, as a priest, like Don Bosco was. So they really tried to live in themselves what they saw from Don Bosco. As I said before, they didn't have a lot of books on Salesian spirit because the spirit was starting to form this new identity. But they have the model in Don Bosco, and this will be very important. Now, just to say this, the practical training of Albera is there at Mirabello. It's in this boarding school. A couple of those young people that he's with will become Salesians. So Rinaldi is one. Another one would be Luigi Lasagna, who was one of the boys at that Mirabello school. And there would be several others. So this sense of vocations would be very strong in that first school. So here they are, the young Salesians working with youngsters outside of Torino, but also trying to inculcate a good Catholic spirit and a good vocational attitude. And they reap some good benefits. You get the first missionaries. You get a rector major out of those boys. So quite a student body, you can sort of say. And the important thing, though, is that they are doing it from what they learned. What they learned from Don Bosco, they're passing on. Now, I'm just saying this because at the end of practical training, there's no real distinct break for Don Albera. He comes back to Torino to study theology, and he's doing that also at the mother house, that is at Valdocco. And so in 1868, he would be ready for ordination. So figure out how old he is. We're in June of 1868. He was born June 6th, 1845, and he would be ordained June 9th of 1868. Interesting, important. He's just turned 23. But there was a difficulty. The difficulty is, well, when he was ordained deacon, the Archbishop of Turin was not happy that Don Bosco's clerics did not all go to the seminary. There was a new archbishop. His name was Riccardi, and he had come in from another diocese. Everything is being reshaped. Turin had been without an archbishop for 24 years, and now there's a new archbishop. And so what is the question? So the new archbishop arrives in 1867, but his problem is, where's the seminary? Well, it was closed by your predecessor, and that was back in 1848. So how many years ago was this? This is 19 years ago. Let's start the seminary up again, 1867. There are a number of seminarians, of course, with Don Bosco, and they all go back to the seminary. In fact, they're not the same seminarians. 20 years have gone by. So there have been new seminarians, new people have come in. Don Bosco's been forming them. He's been working with the Vicar General of the Archdiocese and with others to form these seminarians while he's carrying on the work for poor and abandoned youth. But he also, by 1868, has a number of young Salesians who have made the promises, in fact, have made the vows. As of 1862, the Salesians made their first vows. And so here they are, Salesians, approved provisionally by Rome already in 1864. And so now we're moving forward. Now the new archbishop doesn't get it. He doesn't understand, well, isn't this a archdiocesan order, a congregation? You're a priest of the archdiocese. Aren't these all priests of the diocese of Torino? But no, they're not. They're Salesians, separate. So Don Bosco tries to express it, or they try to explain it, but the new archbishop is in a hurry, and he wants his seminary opened. And so he first of all ordains deacons, and he ordains Albera deacon, but he says to him very curtly, now you should go to the seminary to finish your training because you belong to the seminary. And Paul Albera doesn't quite know what to do because he belongs to the Salesians. But Yes, Monsignor, yes, yes, Your Grace. He agrees, or whatever he can say. What do you say when an archbishop is coming down in your face and saying you got to get to the seminary? There's another aspect, because why is the archbishop so worried about Albera? There's other clerics and he's not interested at all in them. But because Don Abrata is saying, oh, I have a seminarian from my parish there, from None, and he's with Don Bosco still, and he should be in the seminary. So there's the parish priest telling the new archbishop, bring my seminarian to the seminary. Here is Albera, who's sort of caught in the middle, and here's Don Bosco not hearing the whole story, and it becomes difficult. 1868 rolls around, and it's time for the ordination of Paolo Albera to become the priest, and the archbishop refuses. He refuses. He says, because you didn't obey, you didn't go to the seminary. This is crushing for Paul Albera, who's finished all his training, did all his studies, passed all his courses, but there was no seminary to go to until the last months, and he did not go to the seminary because he was a Salesian. So what's the question? So what does Don Bosco do? He calls up another friend of his who is a bishop in Alba, and he sends his priest to be ordained, that is Paolo Albera, to be ordained. And so there he is, ordained by another bishop outside of Torino in June of 1868. So this is it. Big suffering for Paolo Albera. And it wouldn't end there, because as he comes back to Torino as a priest, the archbishop is beyond angry. What do you mean you got ordained outside the diocese? So, but Albera has to swallow all of these things. So those first months, you could say, are a little bit difficult. But there's also a great glory. The same month that he's ordained is the month when the Church of Mary Help of Christians is consecrated. There it is. So June of 1868, the church, which today we call the Basilica of Maria Ausiliatrice, is dedicated, consecrated, and Paul Albera will remember his whole life that he was ordained in that same month with the consecration of Don Bosco's church, Basilica. Now he'll stay there for a couple of years still, but then in 1871, Don Bosco will send him to Genoa, to a new area that he's opening up just outside of the city in the port area, San Pier d'Arena. San Pier d'Arena is sort of the port area. It's a growing area. You have a lot of migrants arriving. There are opportunities because of the port, and there's a lot of poverty, and there's a lot of exploitation of young people, just like Torino had been in the early 1840s. And so here we are, the early 1870s, 30 years later. 30 years after Don Bosco began, here now Albera is sent to San Pier d'Arena. And he has a crew of 5 Salesians with him, 2 brothers and 3 clerics, and he's the only priest, and so they're going to go to San Pier d'Arena. Now, of course, he's told his family and his friends, and people give him donations so that he can go. And they're ready to leave on the train, and Don Bosco accompanies them to the train station. And Don Bosco says to him, Paolo, I didn't think, do you need any money? And Don Bosco's reaching into his cassock here, where he had his wallet, to pull out to give Don Albera some money for the trip. He says, no, Don Bosco, I have money. He says, oh, do you? How much do you have? He says, I have 500 lire. So figure what a lire was worth then, but I have 500 of them. That was a lot of money. Don Bosco, 500. Oh, let me see. So Albera gives him all the money. Don Bosco takes it and he goes through it. And then he puts in his wallet 450, and he gives him 50 back. He goes, here, use this. And Albera, of course, is surprised. He's got to start a house. They've got the land. They've got the build. He's got 50. That's all he has. And he looks so surprised, and he's starting to blush, like, I'm wondering, what am I going to do? How am I going to do it? And And Don Bosco looks at him and goes, "Oh, Paulino, don't you think that divine providence exists also in Genoa? Don't worry, you go there, God will take care of you." "Okay, you better go. The whistle is blowing. The train is leaving." So there he gets on the train. They're all in the train and they're waving goodbye to Don Bosco. Here's Paul Albera. No money, basically. Just 50 what, euros? $50? 50, what does he have? Lire? That's not much. And he's got to start all of this. He's got to be able to feed these, start a school, invite students. And he thinks of those words, "Don't you think that there's divine providence also in Genoa?" So they arrive and they go there, and soon they're able to start. And how does he start? Because in Torino he knows the Vincent de Paul Society, of which Don Bosco was a member. And there, the Vincent de Paul Society in Genoa are there to meet him, because the Vincent de Paul people, you can say, in Torino have told their people in Genoa, and they come out and they meet him and they begin to work with him. So the St. Vincent de Paul Society works with him to start this work for poor and abandoned youth in Genoa. And the place will be built, and Don Albera will name it St. Vincent. St. Vincent de Paul. So it is named after Vincent de Paul because of the help of the Vincent de Paul Society, because divine providence, and just like Vincent de Paul hopes for and looks for help from the local community, so Albera is looking for help there, and they begin the school. So this will be the second great work, you could sort of say, of the Salesians outside of Torino. So the Vincent de Paul school that Don Albera, school, oratory, boarding, trades, all those things, everything that you had at Valdocco will be there at San Pier d'Arena. And Albera imitates what he saw, and he begins in all those ways. Now he'll be there, and I'm just not going into all the details, but just to tell you that he'll be there until several years later, when Don Bosco decides to send him to Marseille and to Nice in France. We had already started a place in France in also 1871, 72. We're starting after there was a big riot in France, in Paris, in 1871, and after that all calmed down, then Don Bosco is sending Salesians to Marseille and then also to Nice. And so here is Don Albera who goes there, and he begins the work then in Nice. So we have Patronage Saint-Pierre, we have St. Peter's Oratory, which they start, and he'll begin it there. And he becomes the first provincial in France. And he'll be there through those last years of Don Bosco, when Don Bosco comes to France to fundraise for the Church of Sacred Heart in Rome. Albera is the provincial, and he takes him around France. He introduces him to people, and working with, the Vincent de Paul Society, they go to all the places where they can fundraise to build the church that Pope Leo XIII wanted, and that church would be Sacred Heart. And so a lot of the success of the fundraising in France happened because of Don Albera. Don Albera working with the Vincent de Paul Society, preparing the way, introducing people to Don Bosco, introducing Don Bosco to the public. Don Bosco is famous because they've heard about the work in Torino for poor and abandoned youth, but now they meet him, and it's Albera who paves the way, and Don Bosco makes his appeal for the funding for this new work in Rome for poor and abandoned migrant youth in Rome, Sacred Heart. And so that moves forward as well. You know, the Church of the Sacred Heart is finished in 1887. Don Bosco dies January 31st, 1888. Albera is provincial, still in France. And after that, in 1889, there'll be a general chapter, and he comes down to the general chapter as provincial. But we can say that in 1892, another general chapter. So 3 years later. They were having general chapters every 3 years at that point in those founding years. And so there's been some changes, there's been some deaths. Father Bonetti, who was the first editor of the Salesian Bulletin, who was the Catechist General, who organized catechetical contests and published catechisms as the editor of Salesian Bulletin. He died suddenly, and he was on the General Council. And so when the chapter assembles, they have a couple of tasks to do. One is to organize the Salesian Society and our system of education. Now that Don Bosco is no longer with us, what do we believe about education? How do we do these things? And one of the other things that they need to do is let's look at formation. Don Bosco formed most of us, all those provincials who were there, most of them were formed by Don Bosco. He formed most of us at the oratory, but we've expanded. How do we form new Salesians? The general chapter. And so with this, what do we see? We see these deliberations, but they have to again vote in the General Council. Now, one of the things that's important to kind of remember about this General Council, the General Council, Salesians were, if you were on the General Council, we just re-elected you. There were no term limits. If someone was provincial, we just asked that he be provincial again. No term limits. People repeated their terms and repeated it a lot. So everybody on the General Council had become General Council. Many of them had been appointed by Don Bosco. Some had been elected, you could say, from that first group. But when somebody died, Don Bosco replaced them. And so when they came to a general chapter, those members were re-elected. Now, Don Bonetti died in 1891, and Rua did not replace him. He said, we'll let the general chapter decide in 1892. So here we are in August of 1892, and they have the general chapter. And they're meeting there in Torino at Valsalice, and surprise, Paolo Albera is elected. He's elected to become the Catechist General, to take the place of Don Bonetti. Big change for Paolo Albera. He is just so surprised. He's wordless, like, how did this happen? He was expecting to go back to France. He had already started things rolling, like the novitiate for us. For the sisters, he was working and expanding the houses of the sisters as well as our own houses. And now he's elected to the General Council. And he's elected as Spiritual Director General or as Catechist General. It wasn't clear what's his role. So when everything calms down, the chapter's over, everybody leaves, and he goes back to collect everything that he has in France and comes back to Torino and moves in finally. So here we are in the autumn, and he goes to meet Don Rua, the Rector Major. He says, Don Rua, what is it exactly that the Catechist General is supposed to do? And he says, Don Albera, the Catechist General is supposed to do whatever the Rector Major tells him to do. And what I'm telling you to do is organize formation. So, in other words, there was no written job description. We had these positions, but nothing was written down. And so this is what he begins to have to do. So, formation. And so right away he begins to prepare and go to the houses of formation in the area. And he begins to prepare formation days and retreat days and days of recollections and exercise of the happy death. He also, as I said, will put together the regulations. The general chapters have said all these things, but nothing has been saved. We've got these documents all over the place, but we don't have them all in one place. And so he puts them together into the regulations to put together with the constitutions. And it'll take him 3 years to put all that together, constitutions and regulations. So this is all part of how he is putting this together. The big effort that he's going to put now is for retreats. And okay, he's given retreats. He's given retreats as provincial. he gave Day's exercise of the Happy Death as rector in San Pierre d'Arena. So he knows how to do that. But as he looks around and he says, here we are, how do we give these kinds of retreats? So he begins to read. And he begins to read very important books, because in the 1800s we have a couple of important refoundings. The refounding of the Jesuits. And the Jesuits, who were suppressed in 1770 by the Pope, and now they are brought back. How do they come back? What's the spirit of Ignatius? The spiritual exercises. The Franciscans were many small orders. There was more like a movement, but Pope Leo XIII has brought all these diverse movements of Franciscans together and says, Francis founded you, unite, become one order. And so they are coming together and they're rediscovering the spirit of Francis and the origins of their founder and why they were founded. And so instead of being the Franciscans of here and there and this movement and that movement, they become one order, the Order of Friars Minor. And so it's a rediscovery in the late 1800s of Francis of Assisi, of the origin of the spirit of Francis. Now, Albera looks at this and he says, now, Don Bosco, let's go back. What's the spirit of Don Bosco? We knew, we were brought up with him, but all these young Salesians have no idea. Let's go back to try to understand the spirit of Don Bosco. What's the way to do this? Retreats, days of recollections, exercise of a happy death, the spiritual exercises. And so, in those first months, he sets out to prepare retreats. I'm going to just say one more thing to end this. How was he prepared to do this? When he was preparing for ordination, one of the ways that he needed to prepare was something Don Bosco said to those getting ready to be ordained. Before you're ordained, you should write out a whole retreat that you can give to boys. Write out all the sermons that you would give on a retreat to boys. And so then give it to me. So they would write it all down. They wrote it all out in copybooks, and then they brought it to Don Bosco. Don Bosco would have them read parts, or he'd read it to see what are they learning, what are they putting. So effectively, the theology they learned was put into preaching, and to preaching to young people, and to preaching retreats. So his formation, the one that the Archbishop thought he never had, was all on taking his theology, his philosophy, his ethics, his pastoral studies, his spiritual studies, and creating retreats, sermons, instructions that he could pass on to young people to train them in the spirit of the gospel in the style of Don Bosco, because he learned it from Don Bosco. And so he did write a complete retreat, which I saw when he was a cleric, before he was ordained priest, when he was a deacon. But now he begins to think, how do we do this? So he will write. Starting in 1893, so in the new year, he's elected at the General Chapter in November, he's taking over, and so he begins, starting in 1893, he will be preaching retreats for the next 18 years. He will preach to the Salesians, to the novices, to the aspirants, to pastors and directors and parish priests, to provincials. He would preach to the Salesian sisters, and he would teach to their novices. And so he really writes all of these retreats. At the beginning, he writes them all out, and then he's called upon to preach and to preach. And I found out in his preaching that on the average, Don Albera preached over 260 days a year in retreats. That left him 100 days to do other things, to organize, to prepare, to be the catechist general, to be on the general council. But just figure all of those retreat exercises and that preaching were so important, and this becomes what he does. The next time we get together, I'm going to open up some of those retreat sermons so we can understand how he preached.